Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going down a rabbit hole that I know a lot of you are already pretty familiar with, hacking. You've sent in so much like articles, research, even some of your own notes about it. And it's fascinating because we've got everything from of like Hollywood myths about hacking to real life cyber attacks and even tips on how to protect ourselves.
Yeah, it seems like hacking is one of those things that everyone has an opinion on, but not everyone really understands it.
Exactly. It's kind of shrouded in all this mystery, and honestly, sometimes it's hard to even like separate fact from fiction. So that's exactly what we're going to try to do today. Really peel back the layers and get to the truth about hacking, what it is, who's doing it, and what it all means for us. I'm so glad you're here to help guide us through this.
Well, I think a good place to start would be just by defining what we actually mean when we say hacking. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but at its core, hacking is really just gaining unauthorized access to a system, network, or data.
Unauthorized access. So that sounds pretty straightforward, but I feel like there's got to be more to it than that, right? I mean, it's not just about accidentally stumbling into something you shouldn't see.
You're absolutely right. The key is really the intent. Are you trying to break in for malicious reasons, or are you trying to help? That's really where those hat analogies come in. White hat, black hat, gray hat.
Okay, yeah. The hats, I've got to admit, I've always been a little fuzzy on those. Could you break it down for us, maybe with some real world examples?
Absolutely. Think of white hat hackers as the ethical hackers. They're the security researchers, the penetration testers, the good guys. Companies will actually hire white hat hackers to find vulnerabilities in their systems before the bad guys can exploit them. It's kind of like hiring someone to try to break into your house to find weak spots in your security.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're basically playing the role of the attacker, but they're doing it to help make those systems stronger. That's a pretty cool gig.
There it is. And it's becoming increasingly important these days. Now, on the flip side, you have black hat hackers. These are the ones we typically think of when we hear the word hacking. They're driven by personal gain, whether it's stealing data, disrupting services, or just cause a general mayhem. Black hat hackers are the ones behind those massive data breaches we see in the news all the time, like the Equifax breach a few years back.
The Equifax breach? Oh man, that one was huge. Millions of people were affected by that, right? I remember having to freeze my credit and everything.
Exactly. That was a prime example of a black hat attack. They exploited a vulnerability in Equifax's system and were able to steal the personal information of over 147 million people. Names, addresses, social security numbers. It was a treasure trove of sensitive data. And the consequences were significant, not just for Equifax, but for all those people whose data was compromised.
It's scary to think about how much damage one attack like that can cause. And then there are the gray hats too, right? The ones who are a little more in the middle.
Right. Gray hats are a bit trickier to define. They might break into systems without permission, but not necessarily with bad intentions. Sometimes they do it to expose vulnerabilities and force companies to fix them, even if it means bending the rules a bit.
So they're kind of like digital vigilantes, operating in this ethical gray area.
Precisely. They walk a very fine line, and their actions can be pretty controversial. One example that comes to mind is a group of gray hat hackers who found a vulnerability in a popular smart home device. Instead of reporting it directly to the company, they publicly disclosed the flaw, which forced the company to take action and issue a patch.
Well, I guess you could argue that they were doing it for the greater good, but it's still a bit of a wild west out there, isn't it?
It definitely is. And you know what? It actually has a surprisingly long history, too. One of your sources mentioned that hacking goes all the way back to the 1960s, well before the internet as we know it even existed.
Before the internet, what were they hacking back then? Rotary phones.
Well, sort of. Early hacking was all about exploring and pushing the boundaries of existing technology. Phone phreaking was a big thing. People figured out how to manipulate phone systems to make free calls, explore hidden menus, even reroute calls. You know who was involved in that? Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the founders of Apple.
Wow, I never knew that about them. It's interesting to think about hacking in those early days. It was almost like a playful exploration of technology.
Right, it was more about curiosity and ingenuity than malicious intent. But as technology evolved, so did the neighbor of hacking. The rise of personal computers in the 80s and the explosion of the internet in the 90s really changed the game. Hacking became more accessible, and the stakes became much higher.
It's almost like those early hackers were just tinkering in their garages, and now it's this global phenomenon with huge consequences.
Exactly. And it's only going to get more complex as technology continues to advance. We're talking about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the Internet of Things. All of these are going to shape the future of hacking in ways we can't even fully imagine yet.
Well, that's a slightly terrifying thought. So how did we go from those early days of phone phreaking to the kind of sophisticated cyber attacks we see today?
Well, it's been a pretty steady evolution, really. As computers became more powerful and interconnected, so did the opportunities for hacking. And as more of our lives moved online, the potential impact just grew exponentially.
So it's not just about stealing data or disrupting services anymore. It feels like hacking has become a tool for everything. Espionage, political manipulation, you name it.
Oh, absolutely. We've seen nation states using hacking to target critical infrastructure, steal trade secrets, even influence elections. It's become a major geopolitical tool.
It's almost like cyber warfare is the new battleground, and we're all caught in the crossfire.
In a way, yes, but it's important to remember that not all hacking is driven by these big geopolitical motives. A lot of it is still about personal gain, whether it's financial profit or just the thrill of the challenge.
That's what I find so fascinating about this whole topic. It's this complex mix of motivations, from the purely criminal to the almost philosophical.
Exactly, and that makes it even more challenging to address. There's no single solution to the problem of hacking. It requires a multifaceted approach, from technological innovations to new legal frameworks. We even have to raise public awareness.
Speaking of raising awareness, let's talk about the impact of hacking on everyday people like us. It can feel like kind of a distant threat, something that only happens to big corporations or governments. But the sources you sent paint a much different picture.
Yeah, they do. The reality is that hacking affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. You know those massive data breaches we talked about earlier? Well, they expose the personal information of millions of people, putting them at risk of identity theft, financial fraud, all sorts of problems.
I know you mentioned the Equifax breach before, but were there any specific details from the sources about how that actually happened? What made them so vulnerable?
Well, it turns out that Equifax was using outdated software with a known vulnerability, and they just never patched it in time. It's actually a common problem. A lot of companies don't always prioritize security, or they're just really slow to react to emerging threats, and that can have devastating consequences.
So it wasn't some super sophisticated attack or anything. It was just a basic security lapse.
Yep, sometimes the simplest mistakes can have the biggest impact, and that's why it's so important for companies to invest in cybersecurity, keep their systems updated, and have really strong security protocols in place.
So what about those of us who aren't running big companies? What can we do to protect ourselves in this world of hackers? Honestly, it can feel pretty overwhelming.
Oh, I totally get it. It's understandable to feel that way. But the good news is there are a lot of simple things you can do to improve your own one more security. The sources you provided actually offer some really practical advice.
Okay, let's hear it. What are the basics? What should everyone be doing?
Okay, first and foremost, use strong passwords. I know it's something you hear all the time, but it's absolutely crucial. And it's not just about using a random string of characters. You really should have a different password for each of your online accounts.
Ugh, that's where I struggle. I can barely remember my own name half the time, let alone a dozen different passwords for everything.
I hear you. That's why I recommend using a password manager. It's a secure app that generates and stores all your passwords for you, so you only need to remember one master password. It takes the burden off of you and helps you stay organized.
Okay, that makes sense. A password manager's going on my to-do list. What else?
Another really important step is enabling two-factor authentication. Whenever possible, it adds an extra layer of security by requiring you to enter a code from your phone or email, in addition to your password.
Right, right. I've seen that before. It can be a bit of a hassle, but I guess it's worth it for the extra security.
It really is. It's just a minor inconvenience that can make a huge difference. Another thing you could do is be super cautious about what you click on and download. Phishing scams are getting more sophisticated all the time.
Oh yeah, phishing scams. Those are the ones that try to trick you into giving away your personal information, right? Like those fake emails from your bank or something.
Exactly. They can be really convincing, and they're constantly evolving. So always double-check the sender's address, hover over links to see where they really lead, and just never download attachments from sources you don't recognize.
Okay, got it. Be skeptical, be vigilant, and don't trust anything that looks too good to be true.
Exactly. And if you're ever unsure about something, just err on the side of caution.
Good advice. So we've talked about strong passwords, two-factor authentication, and being wary of those phishing scams. Any other tips for staying safe online?
Let me think. One thing that often gets overlooked is keeping your software updated. Those updates may seem annoying, but they often include security patches that fix vulnerabilities hackers could exploit. So make sure you're installing those updates ASAP.
Because outdated software is basically like leaving the door wide open for hackers, right?
Exactly. You're making it super easy for them to waltz right in. Another thing to keep in mind is the importance of backing up your data.
Backups. I know I should be doing those more often, but it always seems like such a chore.
I know, it's easy to put it off. But trust me, if you ever get hit with a ransomware attack or your hard drive crashes, you'll be so grateful you have those backups.
Ransomware, that's the one where they lock up all your files and demand money to get them back?
That's the one. It's a huge problem that can affect anyone. Individuals, organizations, everyone.
Okay, you've officially convinced me. Backups are happening. So we've covered a lot of ground here in terms of protecting ourselves, but what about the bigger picture? What's the future of hacking? What are the big trends we should all be watching out for?
That's a great question, and it's one that your sources touch on in some really interesting ways. We're talking about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the Internet of Things. All of these are going to have a profound impact on the future of hacking.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What about AI? How could that change the game when it comes to hacking?
Well, AI can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, hackers could use AI to automate attacks, make them more sophisticated and harder to defend against. Imagine AI-powered phishing scams that are so personalized and convincing that it's almost impossible to tell them apart from the real thing.
Wow, that's a scary thought. So AI could make hackers even more effective.
Potentially, yes. But AI can also be used to bolster cybersecurity, too. It can be used to analyze huge amounts of data to detect patterns and anomalies that might indicate an attack. It's like having an army of digital detectives constantly monitoring your systems.
So it's like an arms race then. Hackers using AI to attack, security experts using AI to defend.
Exactly. A constant game of cat and mouse. And it's only going to get more intense as AI gets more advanced.
Okay, what about quantum computing? I have to admit, that one's a bit of a mystery to me. How could that impact hacking?
Quantum computing is a whole other level. It has the potential to completely disrupt everything we know about cybersecurity, particularly when it comes to encryption.
Encryption, the thing that keeps our data safe online.
Exactly. The encryption algorithms we use today rely on complex math problems that would take traditional computers years to crack, even centuries. But quantum computers, with their insane processing power, could potentially break these algorithms in a fraction of the time.
So does that mean all our data will be vulnerable? Should we be panicking?
It's definitely a valid concern, and it's something that security experts are working hard to address. There's a lot of research going into developing new encryption methods that are resistant to quantum attacks, but it's a race against time.
So quantum computing could be a total game changer for both hackers and the people trying to stop them.
Absolutely. It's a whole new frontier in cybersecurity.
And what about the Internet of Things? Where does that fit in?
Well, the Internet of Things, or IoT, is essentially the connection of everyday objects to the Internet. We're talking about smart homes, wearable devices, connected cars, even your refrigerator.
Okay, so basically everything's connected these days. But how does that relate to hacking?
Well, each connected device is a potential entry point for hackers. Think about it. If your smart refrigerator or your fitness tracker gets hacked, that could give attackers access to your whole home network, even your personal data.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way. It's kind of unsettling to think about how many potential vulnerabilities we have, especially with how connected our lives are these days.
It's true. But the Internet of Things also presents opportunities for innovation in cybersecurity. New technologies and approaches are being developed to secure these devices and protect our data.
So it's this constant back and forth, this push and pull between hackers and the people trying to stop them. It never really ends, does it?
Nope, that's just the nature of cybersecurity. It's a constantly evolving landscape, a never-ending game of cat and mouse, where both sides are always learning and adapting.
We've covered so much in this deep dive, and we still haven't even talked about the ethical considerations of hacking. But unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. Don't go anywhere, though. We'll be right back to continue exploring the world of hacking. We're back and ready to keep diving into the world of hacking. You know, before the break, we were talking about AI, quantum computing, the Internet of Things. It seems like the future of hacking is going to be pretty wild.
Oh, it definitely is. And, as technology keeps advancing so rapidly, the ethical considerations are only going to become more complex, too.
Right, and I think that's something we haven't really touched on yet, the ethics of hacking. It's easy to just think of it as black and white, good versus evil. But like you said before, it really all comes down to intent.
Exactly. And those lines can get really blurry. Think about those gray hat hackers we talked about. They might be breaking into systems without permission, but often they're doing it to expose a vulnerability and force a company to up their security game. Are they criminals or are they doing a public service? It's not always so easy to say.
That's true. And the sources you sent in actually had some interesting examples of this ethical gray area. There was a story about a group of hackers who broke into a major social media company's systems to expose a flaw in their privacy settings. They said they were trying to protect users' data, but the company obviously saw it as a crime.
It's a classic ethical dilemma. And honestly, we're just going to see more and more of these situations as hacking gets more sophisticated and intertwined with our lives. One of the sources even posed the question, could hacking ever be considered a form of ethical activism?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, on one hand, you could say that breaking the law is never okay, even if you think it's for a good cause. But then what if hacking is like the only way to expose some kind of wrongdoing or hold powerful people accountable?
It's complicated, right? No easy answers. Ultimately, I think it comes down to each person's perspective. What one person sees as ethical hacking, another person might see as just straight-up criminal activity. There's no universal standard.
So then how do we navigate this gray area? How do we decide where the line is?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to be having open and honest conversations about the ethics of hacking. We have to understand the different perspectives and really develop a more nuanced understanding of what's at stake. And we need to be teaching people how to think critically about technology and how it impacts society.
I agree. We can't just pretend hacking isn't happening. We need to be informed and engaged, and we need to be a part of that conversation.
Exactly. And I think the sources you sent in really highlight how important that is. It's not just about understanding the technical stuff, it's about understanding the human element of it all. The motivations, the ethics, and how it affects our everyday lives.
Well, I think we've definitely given our listeners a lot to think about today. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of hacking to the really complex ethical questions it brings up. It's been a fascinating journey.
It has, but it's an important one. The more we all understand about hacking, the better we'll be able to navigate this digital world.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's so important to remember that hacking is constantly evolving. What we know today might be totally outdated tomorrow. So it's critical to stay informed, to be adaptable, and to always be willing to kind of challenge what we think we know.
Right. We can't just sit back and relax. We have to be proactive about our cybersecurity, and we need to be engaged in this broader conversation about technology.
Exactly. And just remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about hacking, the less power it has over us.
I love that. Well said. Well, it's been great having you here today. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about hacking.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of hacking. I hope you found it informative and maybe even a little empowering.
And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there in the digital world.